So today we're going to talk about independent t-tests and paired t-tests. So these are used when you're comparing two sample means to one another. For example, an independent t-test could be when you're seeing if mean cholesterol variable differs between males and females. Paired t-test would be mean cholesterol variable changing from before to after a program. Those would be linked because they're the same group being measured at two different time points. For these tests, you will always have continuous dependent variables. Your independent variables will always have two categories and they'll be measured nominally. The main question you need to ask to determine between an independent and a paired t-test is, are you able to be in both groups at the same time or not? So here are some of our objectives and outcomes. The main thing is that we'll be linking these tests we're learning to different program evaluation designs. For your applied learning experience, if you're going to be evaluating the effectiveness of a program, you'll need to be able to link the design with a research question as well as the statistical test. And this will help you write up the method section for your project. Here's the statistical test matrix. There are a bunch of different guides that you can use. This is what I've found to be most helpful. But you can also use any of the resources provided on the content overview for this module page. There's 4, I believe, different websites you can use that are similar to this. You don't need to memorize this, but it is a super useful tool, and I don't expect you to memorize it. I still use this to help me make decisions on which test is appropriate. Yes, we're going to cover almost all of these tests by the end of the semester, but don't get overwhelmed. We're going to learn them one at a time. So what you'll do is you'll go to the left column and find the level of measurement for your dependent variable, the variable you want to see if it changes. And then across the top row, that'll be your independent variable. And if it has one sample, which we will use infrequently, 2 sample or categories, and then if it's independent or if they're paired categories, and then if there's 3 or more, those are independent or dependent paired. And then we'll also be talking about some correlations. So I recommend that you identify these components in a research question before you come to use this table. So does the DV differ by the IV/IV categories? So when you're reading a question, you want to identify that DV and that IV and their categories. So an example could be, is the maternal age statistically different by those children with autism versus those without autism? So our DV would be maternal age, and that would be measured continuously. And our IV would be autism, measured nominally as yes, the child has autism, or no, the child does not. So are those 2 categories then dependent on one another, or are they independent? Can you be in both of those groups at the same time versus no? Well, you can't have autism and not have autism at the same time. So those 2 categories are independent. So in that case, you would go to the continuous row, under the first column, you would go to the continuous row, go across to the 2 samples categories that are independent, and where those 2 intersect, you would see there's an independent t-test, and that's the test you would perform. Another example, does mean cholesterol differ from before to after an intervention? Well, in this case, your DV is cholesterol, and it's measured continuously. So again, you would go to the continuous row. And then your program is not the IV, it would be time, because you're looking to see if the cholesterol values differed from the time before the intervention to the time after the intervention. There aren't 2 interventions. So in this case, these values depend on one another because they're the same people being measured at 2 time points. So this would be a paired or dependent categories. So you would go to the continuous row, go up to the top, there's 2 samples or categories, they're dependent, and where those 2 where the column and the row meet is the paired t-test, and that's the test you would perform. For the homework, this module 6, if your DV is not continuous, something's wrong, because you have to have a continuous DV in order to use the independent and paired t-tests. And I'm not going to confuse you by asking you otherwise for this module. So an overview of two-sample significance testing, the rationale is that two samples of data are collected and the sample means are calculated. And then these means can differ a little bit or by a lot. If the samples come from the same population, we would expect their means to be roughly equal, although it is possible for their means to differ by chance. We would expect large differences between sample means to occur infrequently. The t-test applies in the following situations. If you want to know if a continuous DV differs by a dichotomous or two-categoried independent variable, or if there's a statistically significant difference between the means of two samples, or if the dichotomous IV contributes to the variability of a continuous DV. Some other assumptions of two-sample significance testing are that they're parametric tests, which are based on the normal distribution and its associated biases. Your textbook talks about bootstrapping. We're not going to be covering that in this course, so feel free to skip over those sections of the textbook or just ignore them. So sometimes we don't want to just look at or describe one group of data, which is what we've done before this module. So we want to look at two groups of data and compare them. We want to see if those two groups are different. So t-tests compare the means from two different groups of data. They can also help you find out if the means are significantly different from one another or if they're relatively the same. If the means are significantly different, you can say that the variable being manipulated, your independent variable, has had an effect on the variable being measured, or your dependent variable. You'll be asked to do two popular types of t-tests in SPSS, the independent t-test and the paired t-test, so we'll talk in more detail about each of them.